Good evening once again, everyone. Hell's Unicorn here, back from a very fun time in the Pennsylvania primary elections. Now, for those of you who may not have been aware of this, I was actually a poll worker, if you can believe it, at the 2010 Pennsylvania primary elections over at the local township building in my municipality. I was doing some canvassing work for the Republican Party, which I switched my affiliation to temporarily so that I could vote in the primary. And I elected to vote for Pat Toomey because between him and the other candidate, whose name I can't quite recall at the moment, he was the more ideologically consistent and the closest to my own viewpoints. And that's how I believe anyone ought to vote. Now people may ask, well, why didn't you stick with your own party? Well, we have this little thing in Pennsylvania called closed primaries. Now, personally, I'm not much of a believer in this system, but it's what we're stuck with. And the truth is that in this particular township that I live in, just outside of the Allentown area, there are about maybe 32 registered libertarians out of at least 3,500 registered voters, so not enough of a party presence here for us to get any local politicians on the ballot. But nonetheless, even if we could, that would be a general election, not a primary. So I was proud to cast my vote for Pat Toomey, and I was even more proud to see that good old Arlen Specter will no longer be our senator. So even if my candidate doesn't carry the day and we end up with C-Stack, who's a bit of a liberal, definitely not somebody that I have a lot in common with, we'll still be in pretty good shape because we will have gotten rid of one of the most lukewarm, hypocritical, lying pieces of two-faced garbage in the history of the Senate, Arlen Specter. Finally, we'll be rid of him. A year ago, I was confident that we were going to be subjected to another 6 years of him, but, saints be praised, he's gone. Now, naturally, Pennsylvania wasn't the only state that had a little bit of election heat going on. We also had a very contentious primary election in Kentucky where my guy, Rand Paul, who I sent about $150 to help with his campaign, trounced his neocon opponent, Trey Grayson. In my opinion, one of the worst Republicans to ever run for office. I watched several of his campaign ads. The man was thoroughly dishonest, and he deserved that 20 points plus loss that he experienced. Nonetheless, it's in times after the primary elections that you tend to figure out who your friends really are, and that's really what the subject of tonight's video is. I know I've been kind of off on a different subject, but I just wanted to give you guys an update on what was going on here. So there's a little bit of a controversy regarding Rand Paul's views regarding the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, for those of you who may be wondering, I have some problems with that Civil Rights Act also. There was a lot of stuff that was woven into that bill that was heavily collectivistic, had a lot of expansion of government in it, most of it needless, and I would say that the effects on the black community in the 4 decades since the passage of this bill have been at best inconsistent, if not, downright negative. I mean, we're still pretty far behind the curve here. I mean, I'll be the first to tell everybody that I think the drug laws in this country are ridiculous and that we need to rethink that, and that it's a bit of a travesty that we have so many people in prison that are African American. But the truth of the matter is that when you get down to it, the failure in this department, to a degree, also ties into the Civil Rights Act. And other people have gone into more detail regarding what specifically is flawed about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, so I'm going to defer to them on that. My point is simple. You can oppose these so-called historic laws that supposedly pushed equality to the backward masses of the South. I use that pejorative in a sarcastic tone, just for the record. And not be perceived as a bigot. You don't have to be a bigot to question the logic of certain aspects of a civil rights bill. Now, this is common knowledge to most people when you approach it from that standpoint. But when you have a bunch of zombies tuned into the mainstream media, listening to neocon blowhards like Laura Ingraham and neoliberal sycophants like people on MSNBC, I know that the polls get a little bit of a better shake there in some instances than they do in other places, but they're downright terrible. Let's just be honest with ourselves. The people that watch these shows, they tend not to really differentiate between what they're told on these shows and what the whole reality of the situation actually is. And that's what I'm kind of getting into here. I expect this kind of nonsense out of somebody like Laura Ingraham. And at this point, it's pretty much sour grapes, because what's she going to do? Support the Democrat? Well, actually, given the fact that she's pretty much a neocon, I wouldn't put it past her. I mean, after all, Ann Coulter was very willing to support Hillary Clinton, depending on who the opposition is, regardless of how terrible she actually was. No accounting for actual principles. Not to say that Ann Coulter has principles. The only thing that she seems to ever have is a very witless sense of sarcasm that's very off-putting. But Rachel Maddow, unfortunately, is a bit of a disappointment here. But not really a surprising disappointment. And that's what I wanted to just really put forward to you guys before I wrapped up tonight. A lot of people within the Ron Paul / Rand Paul, original Tea Party movement before it became infested with establishment Republicans, have this viewpoint that we need to be conciliatory and we need to try to work with the neolibs and the socialistic left in America. But there's a problem with this. Even though we may have some common ground with these people, such as, not wanting our troops getting shot at in countries that they don't need to be in, and not having an imperialistic foreign policy, and not having the country being run by corrupt banks, when push comes to shove, the disconnect between us and the new left and the, establishment socialist left become much more pronounced. And eventually what happens is you have what were thought to be unlikely bedfellows stabbing each other in the backs. In this case, the people on the left stabbing us in the back on certain things. We'll take particular note of Bernie Sanders stabbing Ron Paul in the back over the recent audit of the Fed. Apparently we're not actually going to audit the Fed, we're just going to audit the TARP funds, which is, it's let's face it, it's a freaking joke. All right, $700 billion out of 10, 20 odd trillion that's been either sent overseas or sent to congressional districts that don't exist. All of that money basically monetized debt that's going to be taken out of all of our pockets via inflation. And Bernie Sanders is concerned about a little $700 billion. In the same way, Rachel Maddow, although she kind of likes Rand Paul because Rand Paul speaks her language on a few issues, when push comes to shove, there's going to be a liberal running. And she's going to be preferential to that liberal. And Rand Paul is not a stupid guy. I think he's aware of this, and I think he's adjusting his rhetoric accordingly. And I don't see it as hypocritical for him to do this. He's entered into a Machiavellian system, and he's conducting himself in a way so that he can win. And at this point in the game, if you're going to play the political game, you got to play it to win. And so my question to all of you is not, are you upset about the whole Civil Rights Act of 1964 thing being opposed? Because we're mature enough to be beyond that nonsense. The question I have for all of you is, are you bothered by the fact that Rand Paul is kind of parsing his words a little bit, being a little bit careful, kind of pussyfooting around on certain issues and picking his battles? Personally, I think he's doing the right thing, but let me know what you think. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.